Well, hello everybody. Welcome on this Sunday evening if you're watching us live or whenever you happen to be watching us, wherever you happen to be watching us in this slightly crazy time. My name is Stuart Maister. I'll be chairing the discussion tonight. And just to say, this is the 32nd, number 32 of the Melting Pot interviews that have taken place since the shutdown. For those of you who know about Melting Pot, who maybe attend Melting Pot normally in Ostrava, you'll know what a shame it is that we can't all get together in person this year. But the people behind Melting Pot have made sure that the issues that affect the world that are discussed regularly at Melting Pot every year continue. And in some ways, maybe these discussions, these important discussions, are reaching more people, maybe different people than normally. But let's hope we're all together again in Ostrava in the Czech Republic next year. Tonight we are discussing something very important. While the whole world has been talking about COVID and the crisis, the really big crisis the world faces, which is the climate crisis, has had a lot less attention. But in the Amazon rainforest, at the center of the climate crisis, a lot has been happening. And that's what we're going to be discussing tonight, to remind ourselves how important the Amazon is as the lungs of the earth, and to really hear from two people who know a lot about what's been happening there, what both in the recent past and in the more distant past. We get a really full briefing to you about what's happening in the Amazon rainforest, and also what may happen in the future, and what maybe even we can do as citizens of the world to help the people that live in the Amazon rainforest and to help the ecology of the rainforest as well. Before I introduce my two guests, I just want to say two things. We're speaking slowly, so because there's a translation taking place, and we would encourage you to ask questions or make comments during the course of this discussion. Whether your English is your first language or whether you're watching the Czech translation, feel free to put your comments below the video in wherever you're watching this, and we will see them here if you're watching this live. Obviously, if it's recorded, we won't see them. And secondly, we're speaking a bit slower in order that the translation can take place, and that's why. So without further ado, let me just introduce my two guests for the evening. David Galbraith is the Associate Professor in Geography at Leeds University, and he's a global expert in the ecology of the Amazon. And he's looked at the effects of climate change, of mining, and all the other human-based activities on the rainforest. So he can tell us physically what's happening there and how important the Amazon is. Felipe Milanez is the Associate Professor at the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil and is a PhD at the University of Coimbra. But he's a former editor of National Geographic Brazil. He's a director of the documentary Toxic Amazon, which I recommend, if you're interested in the subject, you watch. It's on YouTube. It was done by Vice, but just put Toxic Amazon into YouTube and it'll come up. It's really worth seeing. And the Guarani struggle. And he's author of a couple of books, The Sertanista Memories and Wars of Conquest, talking about the history of this area. So he's really a long-standing campaigner, particularly for indigenous people. So welcome both. Let me start by establishing for us the context of this discussion. David, if I can start with you, give us all, remind us, why is the Amazon so important to the world as a whole?
Okay, hi Stuart, thank you for the invitation to be here. Yes, the Amazon is massively important for the planet. I think to think about that, we should first of all consider the size of the Amazon. So the original forest area of the Amazon spans an area of 5.5 million square kilometers. And just to put that into perspective, that's equivalent to about 20 United Kingdoms, 70 Czech Republics. And that sheer size makes the Amazon incredibly important in global biogeochemical cycles and in the global climate system. I would say a key contribution of the Amazon is that it currently absorbs around 10 to 15% of global CO2 emissions. So last year, we emitted globally about 36 billion tons of CO2. Now, only about half of that stayed in the atmosphere. The other half was taken up through photosynthesis of the vegetation on the land surface and by phytoplankton in the ocean. And the Amazon was a very important part of that uptake. It took up a lot of those extra CO2 emissions that we emitted to the atmosphere. And by doing that, what it's done is effectively the Amazon is helping to slow the rate of global warming. So it's doing this massive service globally. At a regional level, it's also very important. So the process of evapotranspiration, release of moisture from the trees is very important in the recycling of rainfall that falls over the Amazon, for example. Air that passes over forests has more moisture, there's more rain than over areas where there hasn't been forest vegetation. So it's very important for local rainfall. And finally, it's a massive, it's a global biodiversity treasure. We estimate that about 10% or so of all species on Earth are found there. And these are, in my mind, some of the main reasons why the Amazon is massively important for the planet.
Thank you very much. So, we're going to talk a lot more about what's been happening there, but we all know that the Amazon has been reduced in size through human activities. What impact has that had so far on its capacity to do the things you've been talking about? For example, 10 to 15% of global CO2. Yeah. How is that its capacity being affected by what's been happening there?
That's a fantastic question. And there's two main ways in which that capacity has been affected. So one is, of course, the deforestation process itself. That sink capacity of the Amazon depends on the size of the forest. And if you're cutting the forest down, you're removing that intact forest sink capacity. So that's one way in which human activities have been affecting forest function. But another way is indirectly through climate change as well. So deforestation is associated with climate change in some parts of the Amazon, particularly the arc of deforestation area of the Amazon. There's evidence now of the system there getting drier, temperatures are increasing rapidly. And the latest research from the group I work in Leeds shows that over time, that sink capacity has been declining, so that the forests are still taking up that extra CO2 from the atmosphere, but they're taking up less than they were a couple of decades ago. And that's linked to some of these climate changes. So there's two things there. There's a shrinking of the size of the forest due to deforestation, but there's the effect of climate on the capacity of those forests to take up that CO2 as well.
But just so I understand, just to pin this down so everyone understands the scale of the issue globally, you said it's declined. Can you give us a sense? Is it a little decline? If it carries on, how big a decline will it be? Just give us a sense of the scale of the decline. So
the trend of the decline, I think it's something of the order of, I think in the 2000s, that sink capacity was a third lower, for example, than it was in the 80s. So it's quite significant decline. At least that's for intact forests, and their ability to take up CO2 from the atmosphere.
Wow, a third. That's amazing. That's huge. Felipe, let's come to the human aspect of the Amazon. Can you give us a sense, of how the human history of the Amazon evolved? Particularly, I know you know it from the Brazilian point of view, and with a focus on the people that live there and what's happened around them over the last 100 years, I guess, since we all became so aware of it. You're muted, Felipe. You're still muted.
First of all, thanks for inviting me to be here with you discussing the very serious issues we're facing here in Brazil to protect the Amazon, to save the indigenous people from this coronavirus outbreak. And and to share with you our experiences of the resistance here, hoping that we are going to be able to not only save the Amazon, but save the whole planet. I would say the first thing is that the Amazon is a cultural forest. It's not...
Felipe, can I just stop you a second? I don't know if you're playing something there, but I'm hearing the earlier part of this back behind you. Yeah, is it just me that's hearing that? Did you hear that, David, as well?
Yes.
Yeah, there's some feedback. Are you hearing, have you got a speaker on there, Felipe, that maybe is playing it? But yeah, do you mind? Sorry to interrupt you, because I want to hear, I think it's...
I'll have to reconnect.
Yeah, put your headphones on and then turn the speakers off.
Yeah. I will reconnect my phone because I cannot listen to you well. Maybe this is the problem.
Yes.
Yeah, there's some feedback. I'm hearing what we spoke about 5 minutes ago. Playing it. Yeah, do you mind? Sorry to interrupt. I want to hear. While you're doing that, you'll reconnect. Okay. This doesn't happen when we do this live. This never happens when we do this in person in Melting Pot. So this is one of the wonders of the world we live in right now. David, let me just ask you then a bit. If you can take us back in history a little bit, just how recently has the physical degradation of the Amazon taken place? Is it something that's happened over its entire history? Is it 100 years? Is it 1,000 years? Give us a sense of a perspective of how this has happened.
Yeah, so I think you're right. There are impacts on the Amazon that date back to pre-Columbian times. We've had indigenous populations there that have impacted the Amazon in some way, and that's still seen, for example, in the species composition that one sees across the forests. But the large-scale impacts on the integrity of the Amazon have all been very recent. So I'll share a graph here that might help the readers, the viewers contextualize that a little bit. So I'll just share my screen. But the focus here is in Brazil. So this is a little bit about the recent deforestation history in Brazil. So we've now lost about 20% of the Brazilian Amazon forest area. That's equivalent to about 800,000 square kilometers. If we put that back in Czech Republic units, that's 10 Czech Republics. And that loss has really happened very recently. The vast majority of that since 1970. But I'd also like to highlight at this point, I think it's useful to think about before we go into the broader picture of what's happening now on the ground, that Brazil there's actually a success story in the midst of all of this that we shouldn't forget. So if we look at deforestation rates from 2000, they were massively high up to around 2004. And thereafter, the Brazilian government took decisive action. There was a program called the PPCD, which is translated into English. It's the Plan for the Prevention and Combat of Deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. And it had incredible impact. So deforestation rates in the Brazilian Amazon brought down from about 27,000 square kilometers per year. And in 2012, those would be below 5,000. So there's a five-fold reduction in what was a space of 8 years. Things have taken a turn since then, and a particular turn last year, an increase by 35% or so last year. But I guess the point that I'd like to make here is, yes, there has been incredible impact. We've lost 20% of the Amazon, but the fact that the Brazilian government was able to contain this deforestation so well for at least that period of time, I think is a message of hope.
Okay, thank you. Felipe, you're back. Felipe, you're back with us. Hopefully we can hear you clearly, which is great. Give us the human side.
Yes, I'm back.
Fantastic. So we've heard the physical story. Give us the human story. What's been happening on the human side of things over that period of time, and even before that period of time, to the people that live in that area?
Well, the first thing is that the Amazon is cultural forest in somehow. We find evidence of human occupation in the Amazon for about 11,000 years. So the Amazon have been developing itself as a forest within human occupation, with a lot of domestication of many fruits and crops. It's a very rich cultural forest. And it's a very beautiful environment. And people can learn how to live in the Amazon, and they can live very well. And they can somehow turn to become indigenous. There is a big part of the Brazilian population, which are we call them traditional populations. Rubber Tapa, Cimarron, Maroon, Black traditional communities, different forms of peasant communities, and indigenous people. So the Amazon is a form of paradise somehow. The problem is that how some people decide to live with the forest. It means to destroy the forest and to destroy people who are there. So in this past 10,000 years in the Amazon, the big problems started about 100 years ago or 150 years ago. First of all, with the rubber boom. The rubber boom, to extract rubber in the Amazon, which to fuel international industry with rubber, it represented a genocide. I mean, many indigenous people were massacred and genocided and killed during the rubber boom until 1912, 1915, but then back in the Second World War. So during this period of time, the Amazon was, let's say, protected the forest, but in terms of the life there, many indigenous groups, they were already genocided, and there was a human catastrophe. And that was a big problem for the forest, because the forest, I mean, we cannot see the forest without people there. But then the big problem started during the dictatorship in '64. So in 1970, there was a plan from the militaries to invade the Amazon. And it was a very racist plan, because it was turned that indigenous people were not humans and they were not citizens according to the Brazilian law. They should be integrated, assimilated, alongside with the deforestation and migrants to the Amazon. So the deforestation that we see today, it started in the late 70s, mainly in the 80s. That's when there was plans to build roads and to destroy the forest and destroy indigenous people. In the 80s, it emerged and made many beautiful alliances, human and forest alliances. The Forest Alliance, actually, you know, that between rubber tappers, indigenous people, many Brazilians from many parts of Brazil to defend the forest. And they created different forms of occupations in the forest, inspired by indigenous life. We reached 1988 with the new constitution and new rights for forest populations, and the demarcation of indigenous land in the 90s until 2010, 2014, let's say. Bolsonaro is the first president that decided not to demarcate indigenous land. So the violence of indigenous people, the violence of different populations who lives in the forest, come alongside with the violence against the forest. So what we are watching now, the rise of deforestation that they've showed since 2014, it come alongside with the violence against environmental defenders, like rubber tappers and other forms of collectors, and the violence of indigenous people. And many indigenous people were killed in the past years, indigenous leaders mainly. This year, at least 2 were assassinated.
Ah, sorry, you're about to, forgive me for interrupting you. I wanted to get a sense of this. So if you take the last few years, give us a sense, you say indigenous people have been killed. Give us a sense of the scale and who they were.
It's around 50 assassinations per year. I think 2017 were around 70 to 90, including one genocide with the killing of 10 indigenous men from Flecheiros, a tribe from the Javari Valley. The assassination of environmental defenders, of environmental leaders, it is the violence against collectives, against communities. So when one indigenous leader is assassinated, such as this year, when from Uruê-Uauau indigenous people and Guajajara, another group from Maranhão, the whole community feel this pain. It's a form of political disarticulation of a whole community who is defending the forest. It's a collective violence. Brazil is the most violent country in the world against environmental defenders. I believe that this next week, Global Witness will release their annual report, and probably Colombia and Guatemala will have more numbers of environmental defenders assassinated, because there is also very violent countries. But it does not mean that the violence decreased in Brazil, but the terror increased. The terror comes alongside with the deforestation. I've been in some areas, such as with the Kayapó, where it's a very beautiful indigenous group in the Amazon, that the deforestation is associated with illegal gold mining. Gold miners, they are very violent, and they kill, they have been in conflicts and killing some leaders since the 80s, but mainly in the past years. So through gold mining, illegal gold mining, that coronavirus entered to many indigenous groups, such as Yanomami and the Kayapó. Bolsonaro is supporting these illegal activities.
Just to know,
so
President
this
Bolsonaro
violence
is
from the government supporting what is illegal.
Right. Sorry.
Yeah.
But just so people know,
Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil,
is supporting what you're claiming is illegal activity. Before we go into that, you mentioned gold mining. I think it's a really good opportunity to come back to David on that, because I know David's done some particular research on the impact of gold mining on the rainforest, not necessarily just in Brazil, but on the rainforest. And I hadn't realized, I must be honest, until I was preparing for this discussion, that gold mining, I knew about logging, I knew about, you know, all the reasons people cut down trees, I felt, but I didn't realize that gold mining was such a big issue there. Dave, do you want to talk a bit about that and the particular impact gold mining has on the ecology of Brazil? We've heard it has a particular impact on the people through the violence of those who are gold miners.
Sure. So I can again share some images here. Is that visible?
Yeah, we can see that.
So yes. So thank you, Stuart. So the drivers of deforestation vary. I think that's the first thing to say, according to different countries. So in Brazil, for example, it really is a case that pasture is the dominant driver of deforestation, but gold mining is playing an increasingly important role. But in other areas of the Amazon, especially in Peru and in some of the northern Amazonian countries, such as Guyana and Suriname, gold mining is a very important overall driver of that deforestation. So this is some images here. This is work led by a PhD student of mine, Michelle Calamandine, which we published recently. So she went to Guyana, to some of these areas where that have been recently mined, to show some of the forest clearance there for mining in Guyana. And we're particularly interested here in how the forest is able to rebound back from that mining. If you look at this from space, you can see the extent of the damage there, the very large areas here with mining ponds. And you know, this is a particularly deleterious, I guess, driver of deforestation. If you think about just the extent of the physical damage to the soils in the forests, often mercury is used in the gold extraction process from the ore to separate the gold from the ore. That leaches into rivers. That has massive impacts on wildlife, on fish, and that feeds back on the human populations there as well. So I've been in places in the Amazon, for example, in the Puerto Maldonado region. I think this is tragic, of Peru, where the local communities don't eat the fish because it's so contaminated with mercury. The rivers are so contaminated with mercury, and it's very sad from a kind of, if you think about the Amazon, So it has now quite an important part in some of the destruction that's going on in the Amazon. That's the damage directly with the mining, and there's all the damage associated with the indirect damages of the mining as well, the kind of construction of road infrastructure and all the rest of it that also feeds into deforestation.
But
So
I think reading what you wrote, I mean, gold mining is even more damaging, it sounds like, to the rainforest than other forms of just cutting down trees.
Well, that's correct. So if you've got a pasture, for example, or an agricultural system, slash and burn agriculture or pasture, yes, you deforest, but you've got the nutrients are still in that soil. There's still a seed bank there. There is some biological legacy there. But with gold mining, you wipe away that biological legacy. You strip the soils of those nutrients. That really sets the system back. It creates a big mess, basically.
Right. Just to remind everyone watching this live on Sunday evening, if you want to ask a question or comment, feel free, please, to do so beneath the video feed that you can see. I remind my guests to speak slowly because of the translation that's taking place. But feel free, we'd love to hear what you think about what you've heard, or if you've got any particular insight. So with the gold mining, we're hearing from David that it is particularly damaging to the rainforest. It makes it more difficult for anything to bounce back for the reasons he's given. Felipe, you've explained that the people behind gold mining are particularly violent towards the indigenous people. They are ruthlessly trying to mine for gold, and they don't want people to stand in their way. But as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the people that are doing gold mining, just as a lot of the people that are doing some of the other part of deforestation, are illegal. In other words, there's no permission for it. They are often quite small local people trying to earn a living, trying to find a way to earn a living. The price of gold goes up, it suddenly becomes worthwhile just cutting some trees down and searching for gold and doing it's just as there is people are cutting trees down for other reasons. There's a lot of people doing this are small groups of small local populations, not just big business. Is that and if that's the case, that suggests that whatever the government does, it's going to struggle to control this. But have I got that picture right? Felipe, do you want to come back on that? Is that what you're seeing or not?
Well, the first thing, as David was saying, gold mining destroyed the rivers. It's not only the contamination, but it's a massive destruction. You cannot imagine a forest without rivers. So along in the side of the mines, very fast, in 2-3 years, you see the forest drying around. And then it can come pasture or just abandoned area. But if you visit an area where there was gold mining 10 years ago, you come back there, looks like you are in Mars, another planet. It's still a heavy destruction. I visited some areas last July, just before the fire season that took the headlines in the world, and it was so depressing because you take like 3 different rivers that were absolutely deforested, and there was on the border of the Kayapo land, which is in central Amazon, a bit in the east part of the Amazon, and it was on the border right on the frontier with pasture. So the degradation of forest was fast. And with the degradation of forest, also the human degradation, the social degradation. The community was more dependent and more dependent on illegal mining. The problem is that what is illegal and what is legal here is not that easy to say, because it's not absolute illegal activities. It is legal to deforest. It is legal to mine as well, but not everywhere. I mean, you can deforest some parts of your of your range, for example, but you need to have authorization for that. So then comes a lot of corruptions to have this authorization. And what is legal and what is illegal, you know? At the same time, you can maybe have mine in your backyard, but not in an indigenous land. So it is like, it's kind of tolerate in the frontiers of the Amazon, those frontiers of deforestation, those frontiers of the expansion of Brazilian society. And the current president of Brazil, he has a lot of support from the people who practice these activities. They vote for Bolsonaro. In those violent zones in the Amazon and those deforested areas, Bolsonaro, the president, he won a lot of votes. So he wants to support these people. And if it's illegal, it's just a matter of turning it to legal. And so it means we have a very intense debate here on ethic and a moral, more than on the legal side of things. Because you cannot make a law that pass a bill that is going to turn illegal gold mining to legal. The problem is much bigger than that. And who is pushing this debate in Brazil? This is a beautiful thing of the contemporary world, are the indigenous people, indigenous groups, indigenous associations. They are leading this debate, not only intellectually, with very influential indigenous intellectuals in Brazil, such as Ailton Krenak, but the Yanomami representatives, such as Dario Copenaua, the son of Davi, which is a great writer. The indigenous movement is pressuring the social media, the press, that they are defending the land. And this is a big problem for our Brazilians and for the whole world. So they are inviting us to fight with them together against the destruction. And the destruction of the Amazon is not good for the Brazil economy or for international growth. It's good just for a few people getting funds, usually criminal chains. They're not isolated. The illegal gold miner, he's not isolated. He's part of a system. And this illegal system has money from US, from Europe. It's international money, international funds. This gold from Brazil goes to Antwerp, goes to New York. So it's not only a problem of how Brazilians are going to fight these illegal activities, but it's a big problem to all of us, for Brazilians and for international populations.
Well, I want to come in a moment very much to what we can do internationally. In fact, we'll come to it very soon. But I just want to ask you briefly, Felipe, if you can give me a sense from Brazil, because you mentioned before we went live that actually Bolsonaro has 30% support amongst Brazilians, which is, in most democracies, that's a big number of people in Brazil, not just the people that live locally and maybe make their living from deforestation, but a much bigger number of people who support him. Now, this isn't about Bolsonaro per se, but I just want to get a sense of whether the wider Brazilian population who don't live, obviously most Brazilians don't live in the Amazon, they live in cities and towns like everyone else. Is this a very big political issue in Brazil? Is there a split in Brazil around this? Or is this just not? You give us an idea of how big a political issue this is in Brazil and where the balance of support is, as it were, in the vast population that don't live in the Amazon.
It should be a big political problem, but unfortunately, it is not. Most of Brazilians, they don't care about the Amazon. Of the Brazilian population, let's say that maybe the population in the Amazon is about 20 million, I would say, out of a population of 200 million. So the biggest part of the population is in southeast, northeast, and south. And they just don't care. Or they may say that they like the Amazon, but they rather go to Miami in their vacation than visit the beautiful Amazon. So they don't really care that much. And that Bolsonaro, he was democratic elected. And he's still having 30% of the population. But he was not democratic elected to fight against the Constitution, not democratic elected to kill or to let die people. neither to destroy the country. And so he's supposed to be elected to govern the country for all, but he's not doing that. He decided to govern only for this 30% of the people, and he's leaving the most vulnerable parts of the Brazilian population to die. That's why the effects of coronavirus in Brazil, and especially in the Amazon, have been extremely unequal. And there's a lot of fake news behind not only coronavirus, but also about the destruction of the Amazon. One of the myths is that Brazil will lose the Amazon for the United Nations or for United States or the international. It would be an international area. I mean, this makes no sense at all. But a big part of the population believes in that. And so they mobilize racists, let's say the government and the fascist government of Bolsonaro, mobilize racism against indigenous people and against the different populations living in the Amazon to justify the destruction of the Amazon. It's not by chance the destruction of the Amazon. It's a plan for Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, he wants to destroy the Amazon. That's a plan for the militaries of Brazil. They believe that it's easy to occupy and to have control of that area if it is deforested and if there is no more indigenous people living. There is a plan of a genocide, either for integration and assimilation of the differences of indigenous people, either just let them die. It's a plan, it's not by chance. So that's one of the limits when we call it only illegal. I mean, it's illegal, but the government wants to turn that legal because that's a plan. And that makes us to be really worried of that. Because as David was explaining, the Earth system does not support living humans without the Amazon. We need tropical forests.
Well, let's just talk about what we, particularly those of us who are not in Brazil, who I suspect and most of the people watching this should be aware of. Now, David, to come to you. Now, I remember years and years ago, 30 or 40 years ago, when this all really, I guess, started happening. For Prince Charles, who, for those of us who are not British, realizes is the heir to the throne in Britain. He's been very outspoken on the environment his whole life, and he proposed that we declare the rainforests. We have in our country the National Trust. He said there should be an international trust for the rainforest, so that the whole international community financed economic initiatives, that local people had other sources of income, and that because it affects us all, as you explained right at the beginning of this. So obviously that idea didn't get anywhere, and Felipe, I think, has just mentioned that some people are paranoid in Brazil that this will happen and they want to fight against it. So the question I would have for you is, when you've looked at all this stuff, is there anything any of us outside of the Amazon can do or should at least know about that's happening in our own countries that is affecting this?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I think Felipe's definitely right. I think Bolsonaro has never hidden his disdain for environmental legislation or his lack of appreciation for indigenous groups, and that's from before his election. And following his election, he's just towed the line that we expected him to toe. In a way, that's always been part of his of the way he's viewed the world. But so I don't think Bolsonaro will listen to voices like mine or Felipe's, but I think he will listen, or has more chance of listening to voices from investors, business voices. And it's been particularly interesting in my reading of this in Brazil. Yes, you have a setup there which is clearly anti-environmental. We have a Minister of the Environment, Ricardo Salles, who is clearly strongly anti-environmentalist in his stance. Many of these measures that Felipe has spoken about, that's definitely true. You've got You've got proposals of law passed in Parliament which seek to legalize, or in Congress, which seek to legalize land grabbing, which seek to legalize mining. All of these initiatives are being pushed. But it is very interesting to observe the response of the Bolsonaro regime to international pressure. So it was very interesting last year, for example, we had the public outcry on the fires. So we had a big increase in the number of fires in the Amazon last year. Now, of course, the fires are the end of the process. The fires are the burning of the trees that are already felled. That's the end of the line. So putting out fires doesn't really tackle the problem. But it was very interesting that that outcry motivated the formation of this council for the Amazon led by the vice president. And the military went in to kind of patrol the Amazon region and put out the fires, basically. Also very interesting this year, very recent developments. I think Felipe referred to this before our live session. I think in the last week or last couple of weeks, there's been meetings with the vice president in Brazil with groups of international investors. And we're talking about some of the biggest investment groups in Europe who manage assets worth trillions of dollars. And they've been very clear to the Bolsonaro government that they want to see a reversal of the recent trends in deforestation that we've seen. This isn't good enough. They've made that clear and put it on the table. It's also the case that there have been similar meetings with Brazilian businesses, members of the Brazilian business associations who have made similar statements. You know, this image of Brazil as an environmental villain, it is not good for the Brazilian economy. Lots of voices, even in the agribusiness sector, have made such claims. So I think those are the voices that Bolsonaro listens to. You know, you've got big trade deals on the table there, trade deals between the EU and the Mercosur, the South American equivalent of the EU, if you like. And there are conditions in those agreements that make it clear that the EU expects Brazil and expects other countries in South America to stop deforestation. So I think if there is a way, this is the way that it's going to happen. I think it's going to have to take that element of international pressure to generate results. But I guess the important thing is it's not what we want to see is just not promises of yes, we'll cut back deforestation or we'll put out the fire. I think it goes into the line of what Felipe was saying. What you're looking at is a change in stance. You know, there's a very revealing meeting last year between Bolsonaro and the state governors in the Brazilian Amazon region at the time of the fires. And the kinds of things that were repeated in that meeting were things like the indigenous groups have too much land, I won't be signing off any more indigenous areas, demarcating any more territories. So what we're looking at, I think the pressure has got to be the point that, you know, promises are not enough. What we want to see is no more of this kind of very harmful legislation being passed, no more of this signaling that illegal activities, illegal miners, illegal loggers have the sympathy of the government. I think it's got to be a consistent package, but I think international pressure can definitely help to do that.
Just on that briefly, we had a question from someone saying, what can I do? So this is an individual. So investors can do that. Presumably individuals have pensions with some of these big investment funds. They obviously are in a country where they meet the local member of parliament or their representative. What can an individual do to potentially affect those discussions?
Yeah, so it's a question for me. Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think Felipe has some answers, perhaps from the indigenous community's perspective as well.
Yeah,
but I think
brief now because we're quite late. So yeah, just briefly.
Yeah. No, I think indeed. I think individuals put collective effort. I think a great example of that was last year you know, the kind of media outcry that we had, the social media, individuals have a lot more power today than I think they have ever had. The social media outcry that we saw in relation to the fires, for example, was massive in Brazil. That kind of, it fed, you know, fed that kind of media explosion and put the focus on Brazil. So I think individual actions add up. Individuals who manifest their discontent with the fact, you know, we had a study, for example, recently, just came out last week, that showed that of the soybean that's exported into the EU, about 20% or so of that has got some kind of deforestation footprint coupled to it. And I think it's up to individuals to, you know, to put pressure on MPs, to get things to change, to go to social media, raise these messages. I think individual voices add up and become strong collectively.
Thank you. Felipe, let me ask you the same question. Particularly, I'd like to understand what, if anything, has the world done that you've seen actually has had an impact in Brazil, where things have changed, some good action has resulted, if anything?
I believe in the past decades, many collective movements happening internationally to defend the environment, and they succeeded a lot with with much less power and funds than the international interest in destroying the Amazon. You know, environmental alliances, what Greta Thunberg is doing is great. She's supporting the Amazon. Fridays for Future. I mean, when you join environmental activism in Europe, very soon you realize that you have to defend the Amazon, that you cannot defend the climate. Europe doesn't have isolated climate from the rest of the world. And not only the Amazon, also the other forests in Brazil and in Africa and in other countries. So when we join environmental movements, we start to get more informed, better informed of the situation, and also to understand more about the forest, about the beauty of the forest, of the lives of people there, reading more about shamanism, about the history of indigenous people, and we can live better, understanding better the relationship with nature. I mean, this is a very general initiative, but it can be effective. We can also, we can donate, even though it's a small amount, but we can donate a bit, or we can pressure and invite more people to donate. At this moment, the situation is so tragic in Brazil that we do need donation. I am now in Mato Grosso do Sul, just outside of the Pantanal, a very beautiful forest area. There's a lot of fires going on now. And there is one indigenous people here called Terena. This week, 6 died from coronavirus, and they do need support, and we can donate through the indigenous movement in Brazil. I'm donating.
Can you mention the website? Mention the website, please, that I think we can put up below this, that people can donate to, so they know where they should donate if they can.
It's emergenciaindígena.apip.info. Emergência indígena. I would like to pronounce it. And APIB, it's articulation of indigenous people. This is the first thing to do. And then we need to pressure each government, because it is an international problem as well. It's not only for buying things, because I think there is one difference that we need to realize, that it's not only to act as consumers. It is important to act as consumers, but it's more important to act as citizens, which include as consumers, include to look what you're eating, but it's much more. It's to fight against racism. It's to feel the pain of the genocide. I cry every day here in Brazil for the loss of some indigenous leaders. We lost this 2 days ago, Cida Neri, which was a wonderful leader of the Chavante people. It's not only the Chavante who lost this extraordinary man, leader, and singer, but the whole planet, whole humanity. We should all cry for this death. Same as Aritana, which is in the hospital now, is a very important leader of the Shinku. I mean, these lives of some groups like the Yawalapiti from Aritana, only 3 people speak the language. Can you imagine if the Czech or the English language would disappear? It's the same. It's exactly the same. What humanity will lose if the 3 last Yawalapiti dies is the same as if every British or every Czech dies and the language disappears. Because each language explains the word and has knowledge and meaning for lives. And we're on the edge of genocide here in Brazil. So we do need to join protests, not only to what happened in Brazil is urgent, also in Peru, but in the Amazon, trying to donate and feel that feeling, trying to read more informations. New York Times came with an extraordinary, beautiful piece this week, and mobilize social media, turnout, citizens, consumers, responsible consumers, but citizens. So we're gonna pressure each government not to support a fascist government as we have in Brazil. Bolsonaro was elected by Brazilians, but I doubt that Americans were not responsible as much as us, because Trump financed his campaign. We have Bolsonaro because Trump was elected in the US. And our brothers and sisters in the US, they're also suffering under Trump. And also in the UK with Boris Johnson. I mean, this reactionary international extreme right conservative is destroying the planet. And they're gonna destroy everywhere where they are. I mean, we need a new solidarity. We need, the Amazon is not only the lungs of the world, it's the heart of the world, one of the hearts, and the brain. The Amazon gives us idea and the heart. So if you can feel in your heart the pain of the destruction of the Amazon, we need to act everywhere for every environment.
Thank you. Well, if you're the lungs, the brain, and the heart, I don't know what makes the rest of us, but I'm sure we have a useful function somewhere as well in the rest of the world.
We have many hearts, I believe.
Many hearts. Yeah,
it's not only hearts, but the earth has many hearts.
Many hearts.
Amazon is one of them.
Many hearts. And let me say, my partner is an Austrian from a farm in the Alps, in the top of the Alps. And she would say exactly the same as you, that, you know, we need to be in solidarity with the earth and get back in touch with some of these important fundamental issues. Look, thank you both very much indeed. We've run a little bit over, but I think with that last plea from Felipe, I think that people can see how important this is. Thank you both for your informed conversation. Next year, I hope, not only will we be discussing these issues in the Czech Republic, but also the Colors of Ostrava has some of the great music from places like Brazil and Africa and some of these wonderful hearts of the world. So we can, I hope, next year be talking about these critical issues, hopefully mobilizing more people to do something about it, and also experiencing some flavor of what exists out there. So thank you everyone for watching, and please come back for number 33 in this series of Melting Pot discussions.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Stuart and Kate and David and all of the organizers.